looking into the church called Smyrna, verse 8. The name Smyrna, it comes from the same word that we have the word myrrh. Remember the gifts that were brought to Jesus, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The ingredients in the temple ointments and things, and also used in embalming the dead was myrrh. How myrrh is produced, it is taken from the bark of a tree. So they take the bark, they pulverize the bark, and then they press it, and the oil that comes out of this bark is myrrh. So it begins its existence under pressure and under strain. The word means bitter. And if you taste it, it does. It's something that's used in perfumes. It smells nice, but the taste is terrible. It's bitter. We find that the life of the Christians in this city, that is their life. It is a hard life. It is a life of persecution. So let's start there in verse 8. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things says the first and the last, who was dead and is alive. The title Jesus gives himself for each of these 7 letters is significant and different for each one, and it relates to each one's experience. God was in their beginning, and He is at their end, that He controls all of those things in between. So very, very important. Verse 9, I know your works. We find this a familiar phrase in each of the letters to the churches, that God's aware of what's happening in their church. He's aware of what's happening in their life. He knows what they're doing, both the good and the bad. He's aware. An important thing to remember. And your tribulation and poverty. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. The word tribulation, it's suffering. It's basic suffering and trials in life that these people are going through, just as you are going through. That next word is interesting, poverty. There are 2 words in the Greek they could use for that. One is poverty, where you are poor and your basic needs are met. You're barely scraping by poverty. The other word, which is the word that's used here, is beggar. You get everything you get by scrounging and scraping. You don't have any resource. And this is the word here. He knows that they are poor. He knows that they are without resource. Then the phrase add in, but you are rich. The phrase add. And we'll find when we get to the next chapter, we're looking at another church that sees themselves as rich. They see themselves as doing well, and he tells them, but you're poor, and you're wretched, and you're naked. So there's a very big difference through the eyes of God of having and having not. You may have materially, but be lacking spiritually. You may be rich spiritually and be lacking materially. In this instance is different from what we find in chapter 3. In this instance, God sees them as wealthy because of their inward condition. We've found throughout history that pressure, persecution, drives the heart of man to God. The bitter times that people have drive them closer to God. And this is what's happening in Smyrna. Page turned on me, excuse me. And I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. A big problem I think that we have in the church world today is in recognizing those who are gods and those who say they are gods. Because you can be in a church, you can act the right way, you can learn to talk the right way, and your heart can be as far from God, but He knows who is His. He knows who His sheep are. Those who would claim to be His, we find not only in the biblical church, but also within cults that claim to be Christian, who change all kinds of things about what they say about God or what they believe, but still claim to be in the fold of God. He knows those who are not. He recognizes that. He recognizes those who are not His. So within the town of Smyrna, and we're going to get a little deeper into this in a moment, their leadership was fantastic. We're going to talk about Polycarp in just a few moments. But the things that are happening in the world at this point in time, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Jerusalem is a mess. Rome is persecuting the church in Rome to extinction. The central point of the Christian world had shifted from Jerusalem, the church in Jerusalem, to Smyrna, where one of the last second contact generation believers was in charge, Polycarp. He was trained by John. He learned at the feet of John the disciple in Ephesus. He was appointed to be head of the church in Smyrna by John. He was one who was looked upon, historically we know this, he was looked upon as the greatest leader in his time period. He was just one person removed from Jesus himself. John had walked with Jesus, and John taught Polycarp.
You said 70 AD.
The temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and if we count forward to when Polycarp died in 155, we find that he was probably a teenager or younger about the time the temple was destroyed. He was a young man by 90 AD and probably well trained and in place by this point. Have I missed any points about Polycarp? I haven't got to his end yet, but
No, that's about it.
he would. You may not have known his name before I mentioned it, but he really is one of the early church fathers.
Yeah.
This is second generation, and we really know less about him than we should, because he was a man who served God humbly, who stood up righteously and was known throughout, and his end is more famous than his life, and that's really kind of tragic, because he was a bearer of the knowledge of the disciples. John handed him directly what he was taught from Jesus. John handed him directly what he learned from Paul. All of this was given directly to Polycarp, and he's teaching it in this city. Well, Smyrna was also a hot point for Roman rule in that region. It was a bit of a capital for that area. And so, as Rome began to shift its rulers to also be a deity figure, although it wasn't as much a religion as it was a political control of the people. We talked a little bit last week about that pressure to say Caesar is Lord. This was one of the things that Polycarp had to face, and he had to teach his people how to deal with. Okay, I guess I'm just going to jump to the end of that. Towards the end of Polycarp's life, and this is historically, you find this in Scripture. He was in his home, and he was waiting to be arrested. He knew they were coming for him because he had defied or denied the lordship of Rome by accepting the lordship of Jesus, because you can't serve two masters. So he has given himself to Christ. He's taught all his people to do the same. He's the leader, and so if you cut off the head of the serpent dies. That's always been the idea. So they're coming for him. So tradition and historians say that he was in his home and he had a vision. He had a vision of flames and a voice from heaven telling him to be the man, to play the man. Shortly, the guards come, they arrest him, they take him before, really it's in an arena. He was threatened with being fed to the animals, even though that had already been outlawed. He says, you have to reject the atheists, which would be what they would call the Christians for denying all the gods of Rome. History says that Polycarp turned to the crowd who thought Rome was God, and he rejected them. So he's sentenced to be burned at the stake. The stake is prepared, he's tied to the stake, the wood is put at his feet. He's given the opportunity, well, before that he was given the opportunity to reject what he had just said and say Caesar is Lord. He says, these 86 years I have served him, meaning Jesus, and he has done me no wrong or done me no harm, depending on whose account. How can I deny him? And then bring on the flames. So he's tied to the stake, and they put the fire to the wood, and the fire begins to come up around Polycarp, and a vortex of wind comes down around Polycarp. A vortex of wind that picks up the flames from the wood and carries it around him, but not touching him. So there he is, and they've got quite the dilemma. They've got this church leader, really the head of the church in the region, executed but not dying. The flames are dancing around him, they're not touching him, and so one of them pulls out their sword and they thrust it into Polycarp, killing him. But so much blood comes out of his body that it extinguishes the flames. Quite an end. The death of the early church, each member that died, particularly in this way, was a testimony to the truth of who Jesus is. Because if Jesus was not who they said that he was, you don't go to death for a lie. You don't. You go to a long extent. You'll keep up your lie to a point of loss. These men give up their lives. Alright, this was the leadership of Smyrna. And this was the struggle of Smyrna. They were persecuted. They, as we discussed last week about the paganism and the problems in Ephesus, they're multiplied big time in Smyrna, where Rome's presence was so heavy. So the great picture of Smyrna is one of persecution. And that they, because of that persecution, not only were they just barely making it, but Jesus says that they were beggars. And that's not a word we usually connect with the church. We don't usually look at ourselves as not being taken care of. But he says these guys not only were just making it, these people were not making it. But yet they're rich. And that's saying something really huge. God was saying there's a treasure within you that even though the appearance from the outside is that your business is destroyed, your homes are burned, you're huddling together in a little commune as poor people, you're rich. Great is your reward is basically what the underlying thing that's happening here. So he's recognizing the internal value of their salvation, the internal value of their growth and maturity, their dependence upon God. All right. Now that's why this next phrase is so very, very important, because the whole crux of this church, this city really, is persecution of the church. And he goes on to say, fear none of those things which you will suffer. Behold, the devil shall come, shall cast some of you into prison, that you may be tried, and you shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. That is truly not the message you want to hear when you're going through hard times. What you want to hear when you're going through hard times is, I'm going to deliver you out of the flames, and I'm going to avenge your enemies. What you don't want to hear is, don't be afraid, you're going to go through it, and there's a reward if you go through it all the way to death. That's not what we want to hear. You shall have tribulation for 10 days. This word tribulation means troubles, trials, persecution. Now, some scholars believe that there was a specific event that happened in that town to the church, which lasted 10 days, and that may very well be true. Very likely could be true. There could have been a siege, something that happened. They point to a few things, but they don't completely fit. But another answer for that is these 10 days represent 10 specific seasons in their future of persecution. And we find that's true under the rule of each of these leaders of Rome. Particularly Nero, who we accredit with the death of Paul. Most accredit him with the death of Peter. He was the insane man that would coat the Christians with wax, put them in the street, and light them on fire to use them as a street lamp. Incredible persecution. Now, this was not straight through this whole period from 64 to 312. There were breaks, and there were better times and there were worse times. But this is very likely the answer that we have for that. Get to the more specific. Nero burned Rome and blamed the Christians, crucified and threw Christians into pits with wild animals, executed Paul, and, as I said, possibly Peter. From 90 to 96, thousands were killed in Rome, and John is himself, the writer, the author, is banished to Patmos. From 104 to 117, Christianity is outlawed, and many are killed. 161 to 180, there's torturing and beheading. This is the persecution that was being warned of. From 200 to 111, again burned, crucified, and beheaded. 235 to 237, once again capital punishment, execution. And from 250 to 253, there was the attempt to extinguish them completely. And execute those wherever they were found. Now, in this time period, $5 million Christians are killed. 5 million Christians are killed in that time frame, more or less. But that's the average estimate, and that's huge. But let's remember that the warning Jesus gave in Matthew 24 was that at the end, persecution would increase. So I want to tell you that in the 20th century, we have a number of Christians killed that really dwarfs that number. You can just look back in history, how many have lost their life in nations where it's illegal. You can look back, really even not too far back, and the Spanish Inquisition was still going on. So, persecution. Persecution is, like I said, one of the signs of the end. The fact that it is on the increase. And I don't hear a lot of Christians saying this, and it kind of surprises me. But for me, what's happening in Nigeria, what's happening in Somalia, what's happening with ISIS in Iran and Iraq, what's happening with Christians in Iran, what's happening even in Christians in Israel, this increase in persecution and also the increase of persecution of Jews is a sign of the end. It's warning us of when we are. The disciples asked Jesus, what are the signs of the end and of your coming? This was one of those latter signs. This is a big red flag to tell us when we are. All right. Those, going back to the scripture, the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. One thing we have to connect to that is the Jews we know as God's chosen people, ambassadors of God, pretty poor ones for most of history. And you and I are ambassadors of God. We are citizens of a kingdom that we're not yet in. It's all right. We're not that formal here. I just dropped my pen a little bit ago. So he's warning. Let me get back to this scripture. He's warning. He's warning those who are fake that he knows. And that's the key there. I know the blasphemies of God is not fooled. We're living in a time of great deception where there's so many perspectives and so many points of view, so many doctrines and so many cults out there that it's really easy to kind of get caught up in it. I know several people who have come out of cults and say, well, you know, it was really difficult. It started out really good and then things changed. We are easily fooled. I can be fooled. You can tell me something and I may believe it. But there is one who is absolutely, positively never fooled. It doesn't matter if you have joined churches. It doesn't matter if you have done all of these great things. He looks deeper. He looks deeper. He sees our intent. He sees the reason behind what we're doing. So you can pretend that you are. These are pretending that they are Jews that are not. Now there are several ways we can, in studying this out, the meaning behind that. But the greatest truth that comes out of this is God knows. God recognizes. And Jesus is the judge. He will finally set things straight, which are not. That judgment day is coming. And finally, let's finish in verse 10. He said, do not fear any of these things which are to come upon you, as you're about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. We looked at that. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. There's great reward for those who follow, for those who value God and His truth, even above their own desires, goals, and plans in life. You know, as we've studied through the Bible, looking at prophecy, we found that there were 5 crowns listed, and this is not I don't believe this is an exclusive list. There are probably more rewards which God has in mind for people when we get there. But in 1 Corinthians 9:24, we see an imperishable crown, an eternal crown. And 1 Thessalonians 2:19 speaks of a crown of rejoicing, a joyful crown. And of course, the crown of life we just saw in Revelations 2:10 also gets referred to in James chapter 1, verse 12. Crown of righteousness in 2 Timothy 4:8, and the crown of glory in 1 Peter 5 and verse 2. So God's telling the Smyrnians, the Smyrnians, that though they're suffering, though they're going through hardship, though they're without, there is eternal reward, great reward waiting at the end of this. And for them, that's a very mortal statement because they're truly facing death. If they don't throw a pinch of incense each year into the fire and say that Caesar is Lord, they face this persecution, imprisonment, confiscation of property, and end game is death. So this is a real thing in their lives. We're in a weird place. America is a really weird thing because historically, religious freedom didn't look like it does here in America. The governments weren't necessarily influenced. History is a fun thing, you should study it out. What's happening over in the Middle East and other places is more normal looking than what we're going through. And I know that's a really strange statement to say that persecution is normal and religious liberty is not normal, but that's true. And we're actually in a weird place because it doesn't cost us anything to say Jesus is Lord. Because it doesn't cost us as much, we don't place that much value on it, and it's easier to do this next thing that we're going to talk about. We're not going to talk about tonight. But worse than persecution is when there is no persecution and there is compromise. Compromise is worse than persecution. It doesn't feel like it. It feels like a much easier, much more tolerable lifestyle. But we look at what Jesus said to these who were beaten down and poor. He says, you're rich. There's a wealth there that Rome can't take away. There's an overcoming there that no tribunal, no fires can take from you. Should have had it open. We're going to talk about that compromise next week as we get to Pergamos. All right. Oh, I'm in the wrong. Here we go. All right. Verse 11. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Now, this is the little ending thing that's in all of these letters, and it kind of moves around. The next phrase, he who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. Literally telling us that there are two deaths in life. You know, you die physically, and then after you are dead, you face the judgment of God. And if you are rich in spirit, you don't taste in that second death. Old theologians like this phrase: if you are born once, you die twice. You die physically and then spiritually. If you're born twice, meaning you're physically born on your day of birth, and then you repent of your selfish, sinful life to God and are born again, then that judgment that Jesus took upon himself is applied to your life. You are redeemed from the curse. You are exempted from that second death because Jesus experienced it. So to him who overcomes. Well, how do we overcome? What does that overcoming mean? Later in Revelation we'll get to the scripture, and I'll quote it now. It says, they overcame by the blood of the Lamb, that's Jesus' sacrifice, the word of their testimony, and they did not love their own life even unto death. In our American lifestyle, we love our life and we love our comforts a lot. They so quickly can become idols to us, where the very thought of them being taken away makes us very, very uncomfortable. But here these people are not only facing losing their stuff, but their very lives. And this is those who overcome, those who love God above even their own life. They're willing to die, they're willing to face whatever consequences life brings, rather than come.